Well, you know, this is not a very satisfactory place for me to be heading here, to say that we just need new ways of thinking. But I don't see any way around this challenge. You know, we obviously need much more communal, communitarian rhetoric. We need to be talking much more about ourselves as being embedded in the land and our welfare dependent upon the health of the landscape where we live. We need to be talking a lot more about government as the mechanism that we use to come together and to make the kind of collective decisions that we need. I would add, too, that collective decision-making does not have to be by means of things that you would call government. In fact, you know, one of the subjects that I think would fruitfully be talked about is better ways to bring people together to make collective decisions that don't necessarily look like government, but they don't really look like private entities otherwise. In the Yale book that I mentioned, Why Conservation is Failing, I do have a chapter at the end that sort of identifies what I take to be the major sort of task that the environmental movement ought to be working on. And number 3 on the list is precisely this one, to be thinking about better ways for people to come together, to talk about problems and make collective decisions on them. I guess ultimately what I want to say is I think that one of our biggest needs today is to sort of rethink how the individual fits together into the community, into various communities. We tend to talk about community in terms of human social terms, but what if we expanded community to include nature as well, sort of the land community? We need to think more about how the individual fits into the community. We need to think about ourselves not as discrete beings, but as members of this land community. And then we need to figure out what kind of institutional changes would be appropriate for us if we really understood ourselves that way. And if we really wanted our institutions to reflect that kind of understanding. Fortunately, we've had at least a few people who have thought about this before. And Michael, I'm sure, knows where I'm heading here. We've had a few outliers in the environmental movement who have gone down this path and reached the point where I have just reached here. You know, the one who has been most prominent, who is much cited, but I think whose ideas are not at all well understood because we significantly minimize how radical they were, and that is the great writer Aldo Leopold, who died in 1948, best known for his posthumous book, A Sand County Almanac. A wonderfully thoughtful book. Sadly, it's very elegantly and cleanly written, so much so that people read through it and miss about 99% of what is in there. I don't want to talk about that book, but instead I want to get into his thought a little bit by starting with a very short document that he wrote, literally a half a piece of paper. In 1946, there was a group of citizens came together because they were dissatisfied with the politics of the day. They wanted to set up a new political party. It was so new they called themselves the Committee for a New Political Party. And they went to Aldo Leopold, who was Mr. Conservation of the day, easily the best known conservationist of that time. And they said, Professor Leopold, would you please write our conservation platform? Well, you can imagine in this day and age, you know, people whip out their computers, they've got, 75 points that cover everything issue under the sun. That wasn't Leopold's approach. He was firmly of the belief that if you don't get the big things right, forget the little things. He turns back into them literally a half a piece of paper, and it has 2 points on it. Now, he's, of course, Mr. Wilderness Preservation, one of the founders of the Wilderness Society, often cited as the first big advocate of wilderness. Wilderness is not mentioned. He is the nation's first professor of wildlife management, author of what was the leading text for years, Game Management, the Wildlife Society. Everybody else invokes his name as being sort of their founder. He was very big on writing on soil erosion and unraveling in the Southwest the relationship between grasslands and grazing and fire regimes and so on. He really was a very wide-ranging conservationist, but none of those problems gets mentioned. All right, what does he say in his 2-part platform? Motivated by this notion that if we don't get this right, nothing else counts. Number 2 in his platform is the one that, having read his stuff very, very carefully, and I spent years reading his stuff, that I almost thought he would have put first, because he was a strong critic of the conservation efforts of his day. They were working at cross purposes. I mean, people were telling landowners to do different things. And he said it's no wonder landowners are confused about what they ought to be doing. The whole conservation movement, he thinks, was vastly weakened because it did not have an overall goal. He said you've got to come together united behind a goal. He spent years of his life trying to produce it. And he ultimately did late in life. There were, details had not been worked out, but the goal was what he referred to as land health. And as he was, ultimately dying in 1948, he was really on the verge of doing a lot more writing about this notion of land health as an overall conservation goal. He was getting ready to give a big major talk that fall. He was the outgoing president of the Ecological Society of America. He was going to give a talk called The Land Health Concept and Conservation. That writing was published, but not until many years later. He really was on the verge of pushing the conservation leaders throughout the country hard to come together around a goal that he called land health. He said, conservation is not about promoting the flows of discrete natural resources, it's about promoting the health of the land as a whole, which he defined, by the way, in terms of ecological functioning. And I'm thinking that all of this current literature on ecosystem services and so on, that if we look ahead, the direction is going about 10 years, we will be right around what Leopold called land health. But interestingly, that was number 2 in his platform. He said the number 1 need for conservation to succeed is that we need to rethink how the individual fits into the community. Above all, how the individual landowner, private property, fits into the community. He was firmly of the belief that we needed to come up with a vastly different understanding of what private property was all about. And that's his bottom line. He said if we don't have an overall goal that we're pursuing, and if we can't rethink how the individual fits into the community in a way that expects private landowners to use their lands in vastly better ways, ways that are consistent with the ecological health of the landscape, then we're not going to get anywhere. Many of you know that Leopold is best known for this essay called The Land Ethic. That term, land ethic, is not something he used very much. I almost regret that the essay carried that title because it focuses on the ethic part as an ethic, and what it misses is the substance of the ethic. Because frankly, what Leopold did in his essay, The Land Ethic, was to take this vision of land health, which it took him a long time to put together, this overall goal, and he translated it into an ethical goal for individual landowners when they went around managing their lands. What he said to them was, you really ought to be evaluating your land uses in terms of how they contribute to this overall goal called land health. Well, unfortunately, people remember the notion that we ought to deal ethically with land, but they have cut it off from this very essential vision of land health.